Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Darna Noor, joining you in Baltimore. We're here today to celebrate the life of Warren Hinckle, who passed away on August 25th. He was 77. Warren James Hinckle II was the gonzo journalist credited with making Ramparts magazine a leading voice for the left in the 60s. Ramparts was well known for its original investigative reporting, cultural criticism, and aggregation of writings by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and the then imprisoned Eldridge Cleaver. Here to discuss the significance of Warren Hinckle's legacy and Ramparts magazine is Bob Scheer. Robert Scheer is the editor-in-chief of Truthdig and a seasoned journalist and author. His latest book is They Know Everything About You: How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. Between 1964 and 1969, he was the Vietnam correspondent, the managing editor, and the editor-in-chief of Ramparts magazine. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good. I'm glad that you're celebrating Warren Hinckle. He deserves to be a legend. He was a product of a working class family in San Francisco when workers could afford to live in San Francisco. He came out of the Catholic Irish community. He went to the Jesuit University of San Francisco, was the editor of the paper there. And he was, I think, very much, there's a lot of in the obit about being a gonzo journalist that you mentioned and his hard drinking, and he was all that. And he had a great sense of life force. But he also was very much influenced by the good side of the Catholic Church. And at that moment, when Ramparts came into being as a Catholic literary quarterly, you had a terrific pope like you do today. You have Pope Francis, then you had Pope John. And Pope John was the one who brought the church back to the teachings of Jesus about peace and the significance of the other and the love of the stranger. And Ramparts was formed by people who were taking their Catholicism seriously, as was Warren. Maybe drinking is even part of being a serious Catholic. I don't know, but he certainly came out of that. And when Pope John had his Pacham Terrace and so forth, one of the first things Ramparts did, even before I was involved, was get very involved with the Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez, and the attempt to organize farm workers, mostly migrant or newly arrived Mexican people, or people who've been there a while but didn't have papers, and so Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and Ramparts was very supportive of that. And the Catholic angle was very important because Chavez was also trying to make Catholicism, a reality, what later came to be thought of pretty widely as liberation theology. Mm-hmm. So I think that Ramparts, Ed Keating, the first publisher, the people on the original staff, that was what got them going. I got involved, and there was another terrific person. We kind of three of us pretty much directed it, and that's the art director, Dougal Sturmer, who really gave the magazine its pose of legitimacy. We used to say, we even gave a false ad to Pan Am on the back of our glossy magazine because we wanted to look like every other magazine on the newsstand. We didn't want to be marginalized as some little lefty publication. We acted as if we were Life magazine or Look magazine, Saturday Evening Post. And Pan Am sued us. They didn't want to even have a free ad in our publication. But the three of us, we brought different sensibility. Dougal Sturmer was this clean-cut former lifeguard from LA, a brilliant graphics guy. I brought a sort of part of that, I guess what you could refer to as the new left angle. And Warren brought that great sense of Barnum and Bailey, and that we can really reach people. He was a great promoter. And
Can you talk more about that? Because, as a 23-year-old working in independent media, there's sort of this legendary aura about Ramparts magazine. So what made Ramparts so special, and what specifically did Warren Hinckle do to contribute to its legacy and to its public image as sort of this important touchstone for the left?
Well, I'll just give you my own example. I was writing a lot about Vietnam. I'd actually gone to Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, and I'd done a report for a very respected institution called the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, a fund for the Republic, Robert Hutchins. Even Henry Luce, the owner of Time Life, was on the board, and other famous people. And they published a pamphlet of mine. But it was difficult to get attention to what was going on in Vietnam. This was the early 60s. And to get people to think critically about the U.S. role. And it happened quite by coincidence. My wife, who's gone on, she's no longer my wife, but to be a terrific human rights lawyer, Ann Wiles, was working with Warren Hinkle's wife in a mutual bond place down in the business section of San Francisco. And they were talking about what their husbands do. And she said, my husband's taking over this Catholic Literary Quarterly and turning it monthly. And then my wife, Ann, said, funny coincidence, my husband is exposing the role of the Catholic Church in getting us into Vietnam, because there was a right-wing Catholic Church, Cardinal Spellman and everything, that were very Cold War oriented, and they were back in Ngo Dinh Diem, the Catholic leader of Vietnam. But, the problem for that position is 90% of South Vietnam was Buddhist, and he was quite coercive. So my wife said to his wife, my husband can't publish his article because people are afraid to criticize the Catholic Church. And Denise Hinckle took my articles to her husband, and I was hired about 2 days later and became the Southeast Asian correspondent, and then went on to play a larger role. So what Hinckle did was he took my story that people were ignoring, and he figured out a way of publicizing it, of packaging it, of getting good art with it, of doing the PR stuff, of getting mainstream newspapers like the New York Times to write about it. And even when that failed, taking out full-page ads.
Right. Ramparts started with about 2,500 readers, right? And then partially due to Hinkle's work, it ended up with 250,000 readers just a few years later. So is that publicity and the beautiful art that you talk about sort of how that huge surge came about?
Yeah, but I wouldn't stress so much that. I think that was important. First of all, Hinckle had a brain and had a journalistic instinct and cared, okay? He cared for the average person. He came from that background. He was a working class kid, and he didn't like people getting screwed. Our model always was the one I felt all my life. I want to know who's getting screwed and who's doing the screwing, okay? That was the model of our publication. And Dougal Sturmer, our art director, felt the same way. He came from a working class family, and we knew that politics could hurt people. We knew war hurt ordinary people. We knew economic policy hurt ordinary people. So we were not just out there, we weren't a fraternity party or something. We had a sense of social justice, and it wasn't just us. It was people your age who came to work for us, including Jan Wenner, who was a copy messenger who went on to start Rolling Stone, actually, in our office, and Adam Hochschild, who was a local reporter who went on to do Mother Jones. So a lot of people, Cy Hirsch wrote for us, so there were a lot of people who went on to influence American journalism. And what united us was not PR, but a sense that the mass media was failing in its job to cover news. That was the real issue, that the mass media was not open. And so we printed Cy Hirsch long before he won a Pulitzer Prize, and we covered, My Lai and stories like that. We covered the reason Martin Luther King came out against the war in Vietnam was that he read an issue of Ramparts in which we had a very moving photographic essay and account on the destruction of children in Vietnam by our bombing. And that's when he very famously said, I've got to come out against this war. And he gave his speech at Riverside Church, a speech condemning the United States as the major purveyor of violence in the world today. Martin Luther King gave a sermon, Riverside Church, New York. The New York Times editorially condemned him.
And Ramparts also exposed the U.S.'s secret war in Laos, as we talked about before. What was it like being at the forefront of the anti-Vietnam movement with Hinckle, and what kinds of sort of reactions and pushback did your coverage elicit at that time?
Well, first of all, when you say movement, it's not Bob Scheer and it's not Warren Hinckle, and it's not Dougal Sturmer. The movement gave the air, if you're a sailor, that allowed us to move, okay?
Yeah, of course.
Stuff was happening, just like you've had stuff happen in Baltimore. Stuff is happening now with the Black Lives Movement. It happened with Occupy. So there was already the steering of a movement in the United States. We did have a draft. This was not an academic discussion. You were going to be, all of us at Ramparts, we burned our draft card on the cover. we were hauled before the U.S. attorney in New York, Morgenthau. They wanted to throw us in the slammer for a long sentence. And we had draft cards. We also had to bend over and, have our bodies examined in line at the draft board and everything else, So it wasn't an abstract question, this war, but did this war make sense? And was it worth losing your life? And it wasn't going to be a voluntary decision. They were going to draft you. So you had a movement of concern about this. We also had a civil rights movement, very big civil rights movement developing. When we were putting out Ramparts, some of us would go and picket Woolworth or Kresge to support civil rights movement in the South. I went to the South in 1960 before I ever was in Ramparts to, witness segregation and to, learn about it and write about it and everything. So, these were the movement currents. What happened with Ramparts is we were the ones that were not afraid to take that message to the mass audience, as opposed to a lot of small left publications like The Nation and others. We said, hey, this is stuff that everybody should see. This is stuff everyone can comprehend. Let's not be elitist about it. And if that means having good art, and it means having good color graphics, and it means doing PR, and it means hustling your stories by having a good lead, and Hinckle was a genius at that, a genius. What's the lead? Okay, how are we going to get the eyeballs? How are we going to market this thing? That's what took us to a different level. It wouldn't have worked if the mass media was doing its job. The main way we stayed in business is we had really important stories that the New York Times and CBS were forced to pick up.
Speaking of this, sort of another legendary Rampart story was, lots of viewers probably know this one, Ramparts caught wind of the CIA funding the National Students Association and unions like the AFL-CIO and other cultural organizations, and the CIA found out that Ramparts had this information, right? And Warren Hinckle got all these ads showing the information in the Times and the Post. What was he trying to do here? Why was it important that everyone knew the CIA was funding these cultural programs?
Look, the great thing about Warren Hinckle, and it goes to a weakness of the left and maybe also a weakness of the right that becomes too ideological. Warren Hinckle loved the United States in all of its complexity and all of its diversity and all of its zaniness, okay? And he brought that spirit, I say, more than anyone into Ramparts. He was not afraid of all of the readers out there. He thought if we could get the word to people in language that would move them, that they would understand, and we could back up our stuff and do good journalism and not just be writing for people in the higher levels of the university and not just writing for the convinced. But if we could do really good journalism and make it understandable and communicate, then, people would get it and they would read it. And that's what happened. They started passing copies of Ramparts around at high schools and college dormitories. I tell you, to this day, I run into people who tell me, oh, yeah, my father used to read you in college. Or if it's an older guy, I used to read you in my dorm. And the pass around of that, sure, we would sell 250,000, but I know we were being passed around in the millions. And we had that kind of response because we weren't afraid of the American public. And that's really been a death trap for people on the left. They think they have to talk to just a small group of the convinced. And we didn't do that. And it turns out, that one of our most powerful, the CIA thing was very important because we exposed the CIA. And the sad thing, I have a book out now called They Know Everything About You that also exposes the National Security Agency and the CIA. And that doesn't shock people anymore for doing very similar things. The CIA is all over Silicon Valley. They've got 27 dummy corporations. They got a company called Palantir that has all of your data that is working for the top intelligence agencies, including the CIA, and you can't get the major newspapers or television to cover it. We're all, the war on terror. We have to sacrifice every sense of privacy and separation of powers and freedom. So, we had success with a story that is still very much a current story. But I think in the main, I'll give you the most important story we had. We had a decorated war hero, Master Sergeant Don Duncan, and he had fought, forget how many tours, 3 or 4 tours in Vietnam, and he came out and said, this war is an atrocity, and he condemned it, and we put him on the cover of our publication, and suddenly a lot of people could see what was not being written about elsewhere.
And just as a person, do you have any sort of stories or anecdotes that you can share with us about knowing Warren Hinckle personally? I think that a lot of folks would like to know sort of, the man behind the legend or whatever folks say.
Look, if you want me to, look, he was a good old Irish Catholic boy of the kind I grew up in the Bronx. They drank too much. Most of the time he wanted to be in some dark bar with a bunch of old geezers and cops and, some seedy lawyers swapping stories. It wasn't the high life. It wasn't life in the fast lane. And yeah, he drank, but he came from a drinking culture, what he had was frankly, not so much any decadence. What he really had was a zeal for journalism of the old school. He was an ink-stained wretch, is what we used to call journalists. People got into journalism in the old days not for money. They didn't even have to go to college. It was something you learned on the streets. It was something you learned covering the police beat. That's what Warren did. The first time I ever read a Warren story, I knew about Warren. That's how I met him. But before my wife met his wife, when I found about Warren, he was working at the San Francisco Chronicle. And they were going to put a freeway right through San Francisco. Warren Hinckle got the idea you're going to destroy San Francisco if you put a freeway through the city, the way Oakland had a freeway running right down its coast. And he started a campaign. And he invented rallies. He said, there's going to be a rally at Golden State Park to stop the freeway. Hundreds of thousands expected. Well, nobody even knew about the damn thing until he got the article in the paper, and then maybe 10,000, no, maybe the first time, maybe 1,000 people showed up. And then he got them to promote that and show pictures of it. And the next thing you knew, you had one of the first great environmental anti-growth campaigns going in San Francisco saying, no, we don't want to tear our city up with a freeway. And he stopped it. You go there today, you'll see where the freeway ended was where Ramparts had its main office on Broadway. We could look at where the freeway stopped. We could see from our office windows at the Ramparts building on Sansom and Broadway. So Warren loved the story. I think he was fact-driven. I think he was logic-driven. He cared about good journalism because he knew any other journalism wouldn't work. But, the slogans we had around Ramparts, one was A.J. Liebling, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. Well, we had one. That was the great New Yorker press critic. The comfort of the press the role of the press is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I don't know if that comes from Marx or who it comes from, but that was one of our slogans. Upton Sinclair, the great, muckraker, in California was our hero. Sinclair Lewis, others, we don't forget in San Francisco when we did Ramparts, we had the strongest progressive labor movement in the country, the Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union that Harry Bridges had built, as opposed to the East Coast Longshoremen, which was corrupt. They were progressive. They were red-baited by McCarthy and everything. So we had that. We had a lot of our elected officials came out of a progressive labor movement. We also were a mixed city. Very early in the day when being a homosexual was a crime, we had a big gay community. We had a big Chinese American community that the city absorbed. So we were multicultural. We were diverse in the Bay Area. And we had real roots. So Ramparts was not some isolated, freakish thing. We were supported by people who were in the advertising business, who were doctors and lawyers. Carlton Goodlett, who ran the major, what was then called the Negro Press, now the Black Press, the Sun Reporter out in San Francisco, he was one of our early backers. Willie Brown, who went on to be one of the top politicians in the state, and then the mayor of San Francisco was one of our friends or backers. John Burton, another one, who became a big congressman and assemblyman until recently the head of the state Democratic Party. So we were not ducks out of water in the culture of California, particularly Northern California. We fit right in. You had a big movement going, a student movement, a union movement, and we fit right in with all that. We just did journalism, and we did it in an exciting, accessible way, which I assume is what the Real News Network is attempting to do. And every time I've looked at it, seems to me to be succeeding at.
Well, thank you so much for that, Bob, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.